Hey, hi, hello. Welcome to Diana Emerson today. We are going to watch, well, listen to The New Detectives. I promise not to fall asleep on you. No promise. Is there enough left to determine what happened? A homicide investigation stalls until a dead man helps solve the mystery of his son's disappearance. Hiding the victim used to be the key to getting away with murder, but no longer. Even without a body, forensics can tear the fabric of lies and expose the bodies of evidence. A dead body is usually the first clue in a homicide. Body of victim, evidence. How can police catch the killer? Without a victim, how can they prove a murder occurred at all? In December 1986, Connecticut State Police were faced with just such a challenge. Hella Crafts, a 38-year-old flight attendant, had disappeared from her home in quiet Newtown, Connecticut. She left behind her husband Richard and 3 children. Her disappearance came as no surprise to Richard. Hella had recently filed for divorce after discovering he was having an affair. The Crafts' nanny, Marie Thomas, was worried. Her suspicions grew when she noticed stains on the carpet near Hella's side of the bed. She called Hella's best friend, who in turn contacted Hella's lawyer. According to State Police Detective Joseph DeStefano, Hella may have feared for her life.
Hella explained to her attorney that if for some reason she disappeared or wasn't around any longer or something wasn't right, and not to take it as being a coincidence, that there was something wrong. And she had asked her attorney, please look into it. That is exactly what had happened. Hella did disappear.
Police questioned Richard Crafts. Though they knew his situation with Hella was rocky, he seemed an unlikely suspect. Besides his day job as a commercial airline pilot, Richard was a town constable, sworn to uphold the law. But as state investigators talked to Hella's friends, suspicions about Richard began to grow.
When people were asking Richard where Hella was, he gave several different answers. At one point, he said she was visiting her mother. At another point, I believe he said she was visiting her sister. At another point, he said he didn't know where she was. Things that weren't consistent with what a husband would say if his wife was missing. That in itself created some suspicion.
Police had enough information to obtain a search warrant of Kraft's house, but not enough to charge Richard with any crime. They still didn't know if this was a criminal investigation or a wild goose chase.
At this point in time, we had no answers. All we had were questions.
They hoped to find some answers in the Kraft's bedroom. By the time they obtained the warrant, the room was virtually empty, apparently to get ready for new carpeting, but perhaps also to disrupt the crime scene. Meanwhile, Richard was on his way to Florida for Christmas, and miles ahead of the police. Something happened here, but had the suspect erased all the evidence? Some of the furniture was discovered in the basement. Before investigators could examine the bedroom, they called in a friend of Hella's to tell them how it was arranged. after the room was back in order, the forensics team found stains on one side of the mattress. Blood spatter expert Henry Lee was called in to interpret them.
The first time when you hit somebody, usually don't produce spatter. You only can create a wound. When the blood starts deposit around the injury area, from the capillary or the vein, now you have pool of blood. The second time you hit it, then you have spatter.
Lee was able to determine from the size and distance the stains spread on the mattress that the blood spattered at medium velocity. That told him a little about the weapon.
We know it's some blunt object, but I cannot tell you that's a hammer, an axe, or flashlight. Could be any type of this blunt object.
One thing Lee and investigators concurred on: they had found the crime scene, and it suggested bloody murder. A faint pattern of blood on Hella and Richard Kraft's mattress was enough to turn up the heat on what was, until then, a missing persons investigation. Now, police felt that Hella might be dead, and that Richard Kraft had killed her. But the proof was scant, shaky. They were relying more on instinct than evidence. If Mrs. Kraft was killed, where was her body? They'd have to do their homework.
The next level of the investigation was a review of paperwork that we had found in Mr. Kraft's background, particularly his credit card receipts.
On the roster of routine purchases, one line stood out.
We found that Richard Kraft had rented a wood chipper from the Darien Rental Agency in Darien, Connecticut.
Though it seemed like a shot in the dark, DeStefano's sergeant suggested that perhaps Krafts used a wood chipper to eliminate the body. DeStefano was skeptical.
My immediate thought was things like that don't happen. They happen on television, but they don't happen in real life.
He went to Darien Rental to see if it was even possible to use a wood chipper to dispose of a body. The rental agent showed him the chipper that Richard Krafts rented on November 18th, around the same date Hella Krafts disappeared.
Okay, essentially what we have then, we've got all the material being fed in through this end,
Right.
and it's coming in contact with the cutters on the wheel over here.
Yeah, which is spinning.
Now, about how thick is that wheel? About 2
2
inches?
inches, yes, sir.
And that's solid steel.
It weighs about 900 pounds.
900 pounds. Those blades, one on either side. So once that wheel gets moving, nothing stops it.
No, not at all.
The only thing that happens is whatever hits that gets cut.
Yeah, you could throw a piece of steel in there, it wouldn't make any difference. You cut it up.
You say that opens up about 12.
About 12 inches.
So 1,200 RPMs with a 900-pound piece of metal, two 12-inch blades. No way anything's going to stop that.
Not at all.
Though the massive blade could make short work of anything in its path, the hopper could only accommodate objects up to a foot wide. It would be impractical to dispose of the body that way, but not impossible. It seemed far-fetched. But while DeStefano was investigating the wood chipper, other detectives spoke with town workers to see if anyone had seen anything that might resemble a clue. A utility worker reported he was out in the early morning of November 19th. He saw someone operating what looked to be a wood chipper on River Road, adjacent to the Housatonic River. That chance observation propelled an otherwise stalled investigation. Attention shifted to River Road.
When the investigators got to that location, they did in fact find wood chips on the ground. And exploring the area all the more, they found envelopes with Hella Kraft's return address on them. At this point in time, we had the feeling that we've got something here that's totally out of the ordinary.
Investigators gathered 33 bags of debris from the River Road area. The bags were sent to the police station to be poured over piece by piece. Anything that wasn't a wood chip or a leaf was set aside.
At first, we would find one hair and not knowing what to do with it, we took a bottle and we put the one hair in the bottle. We would continue on. We'd find an object that was harder than wood, but softer than stone. So we felt that we'll start another bottle for items such as these.
Out of the mulch, a grisly scenario was taking shape. Based on these initial findings, a tent was set up to process evidence on site. Konstantin Karazoulis, the state's chief forensic odontologist or dental expert, was called in hopes of locating human dental remains.
We would collect evidence and bring it into a tent, and we would put it through some water, through a filter, and look for things that were human parts.
Circumstantial evidence was piling up. The blood in the bedroom, the wood chipper rental, the unidentified fragments in the wood chips. But there was still no body. And without a body, there was no crime.
Okay.
They needed to find something more definite. Investigators
Need a
knew
body.
they had to turn the case around.
No body,
killer
no
would walk.
crime.
While evidence of a crime was turning up along River Road, police continued interviewing potential witnesses. One spotted a man with a wood chipper on November 19th on a bridge about a mile south of the River Road site. Divers were sent to the bridge to see what they could recover. The water under a bridge is the repository of all things broken and discarded. It's a dumping ground for vandals, and a place where unwanted possessions are tossed and forgotten. Most are mundane, but sometimes the unexpected turns up. Dan Lewis was one of the divers.
What we were looking for was anything that could have been used as a weapon. We were looking for any type of a container, and certainly any more body fragments. Underneath this bridge, there's many parking meters, road signs, shopping carts, the usual kind of things that you'll find discarded off of a bridge. I mean, something like a chainsaw or a type of weapon would be totally out of place. When they came up with that, we immediately knew that we may have something here that pertains to that case.
Like everything else in this case, the chainsaw's connection was tenuous. The tool was sent to Dr. Lee's lab to see if a link could be made. Meanwhile, a mile north at the tent, Detective DeStefano was making a gruesome discovery of his own.
I had just put some debris into the screen. I had rinsed it off, and my normal course was after I would rinse, I would go through with my finger just to make sure that it was totally rinsed. As I was going through, you develop a certain feel for what you're dealing with, and wood chips have a certain consistency about them. As I went through, I felt something that didn't feel like a wood chip. It felt slippery. And when I held it under the light, I found it to be the tip of a finger.
The evidence of the crime was becoming ever more apparent, but it still wasn't strong enough to prove Hella's murder or to name her killer. The pieces would start to come together in Lee's lab as the chainsaw was studied.
The chainsaw deposit in the river must have a reason. We initially don't know what's the significance and the linkage. But by examining the chainsaw, we found tiny fragment of hair. Under a higher power magnification, microscopic examination, we made a determination.
Oh, I love these crime shows.
Not only human, we noticed this hair was bleached and dyed.
Wow.
To Lee's assistant, Elaine Pagliaro, the bleached and dyed hairs were all too familiar. Over 2,000 of them had already been recovered from the wood chips and examined.
The roots were of something we call paintbrush type. This paintbrush appearance to a root is characteristically found when hair is in tissue, and then that tissue starts to putrefy. and the chemicals from the putrefaction affect the appearance of the hair root. So it ends up looking just like a paintbrush. That's important in an investigation such as the Crafts case because it indicates that the hair was in tissue and wasn't from a beauty parlor and dumped alongside the road.
The hairs were then compared to hair from the victim's hairbrush, recovered from the Crafts house. They matched. The chainsaw was then taken apart. Inside the housing were blue-green cloth fibers and remnants of flesh and blood. The fibers were the same color and fabric as Ella's nightclothes. The flesh in the chainsaw proved to be human, and the blood type matched Ella Crafts. Now it was a matter of finding out who the chainsaw belonged to. The serial number was corroded from being underwater, but Elaine Pagliaro was able to restore it.
Because of the nature of the way metal is formed, the impression goes through several layers. So even if you scrape off the top layer, if you take away that scraped portion, you should be able to raise up the impressed areas below.
She applied a chemical to the surface of the plate, which dissolved the corroded layers of metal, revealing the serial number.
The number is E59211616. All my career, I remember that number.
The serial number was traced back to the dealership. The chainsaw had been purchased by Richard Crafts. The forensics on the chainsaw potentially linked victim and killer, but investigators still had to prove that Ella Crafts was truly dead. After combing the banks of the River Road site for more than a week, Dr. Karazoulis found the final piece of the puzzle.
And as I looked down, I noticed there was an object. And that object turned out to be a human tooth.
In forensics, this is the Holy Grail.
I knew I had everything that I would need to make an identification of a human being.
A comparison with dental records proved the tooth belonged to Ella Crafts. But it suggested more than that. Part of the jawbone was still clinging to the tooth, and part of the root was cut off.
If this tooth were just removed, you wouldn't see this type of a fracture, or you wouldn't see bone attached to it in this way. So I believe that some force broke this tooth from its seat in the jaw and crushed whatever it was holding to pieces.
That force could have been a chainsaw or a wood chipper. Richard Crafts could be connected to both objects, and now indisputably to the victim, his wife, Ella Crafts. The circle was closing in on the airline pilot. The condition of the tooth, coupled with the hair and skin evidence, was enough to allow the medical examiner to declare Ella Crafts dead 2 months after she disappeared. Based on the trail of evidence, police reconstructed the likely scenario of Ella Crafts' death. On the night of November 18th, Ella was preparing for bed when Richard struck her with a blunt object. He got rid of the fuzzy sheets, but left telltale stains on the mattress and carpet. He had already rented the wood chipper, probably for some legitimate purpose. Then he realized he had the opportunity to kill his wife and use the chipper to dispose of her body. But he knew the opening in the machine wasn't wide enough to fit a human torso. That's where the chainsaw came in.
This isn't something that you would do to an animal.
Mm-mm.
It's just not something that you do. I mean, it's totally beyond the realm of what people do to each other.
Only 6 ounces of material from Hellecraft's remains was ever recovered. Less than 1/1000th of a human body. But it was enough for the police to make their case.
Most people don't realize two things. Number one, the lengths to which the police will go to investigate a crime. And number two, the power of forensics. They don't realize the new developments that have happened within the past few years that have revolutionized forensics in criminal investigation. It's incredible what can be done now when you blend science with investigation.
For his crime, Richard Kratz received a 50-year sentence. His unconventional way of disposing of the body proved to be his undoing, though it took a battery of forensics experts to prove it. But not everyone has access to those resources. One woman's desperate search for her sister would consume 14 years of her life. Ava Dehart was looking for a good time, but she fell in with a bad crowd. Her circle of friends was a motley group of biker wannabes, a touch of menace in the otherwise sleepy riverside town of Fredericksburg, Virginia, in 1982. They hung out at a place called the Joker's Wild, a loose-knit gang with too much time on their hands. Ava's boyfriend was the leader of the group. His name was George Patsalos, but he called himself George Sparta. He was a man who was more feared than respected. Ava had dated him for 8 years. During that time, their relationship grew more abusive. Occasionally she'd leave him, but never for long. On July 20th, 1982, Ava left her house to go to work at the Joker's Wild. That was the last anyone ever saw of her. After a day had gone by with no sign of Ava, her family contacted the Stafford County Sheriff's Department. Detective Billy Bowler explains the investigation.
When the investigation was first initiated, it was a missing persons report, and our sheriff at the time was chief of detectives and picked up the case. He followed through with interviewed the family. He went to interview Patsalos. Patsalos produces a handwritten letter that was confirmed through family members that it was in her handwriting, more or less a Dear John type letter. I'm leaving. Thanks, Pat. See you later, that kind of thing. I'm not coming back.
If George knew where Ava had gone, he wasn't telling. Neither was anyone else. With no leads and no clear signs of foul play, the sheriff's investigation could go no further.
I think Patsalos, of course, was targeted as a suspect or an individual responsible right from Jump Street, but they had no one coming forward with any information. There was no, we had no body, we had no forensic evidence, we had no Ava Dehart.
And Ava's family had no consolation. Ava's sister Debbie suspected a conspiracy of silence among the gang at the Joker's Wild. She felt the police taking the case
The attitude was a bit hard to deal with in the beginning because I would take them a rumor that I heard or someone that said something, and they would contact me again and tell me they'd followed up on it, and then we go through this cycle, this whole roller coaster, emotional roller coaster of going to them, giving them information, and then having nothing come of it. And it was very difficult to do.
Debbie was relentless in her pursuit of the truth. Desperate to find her little sister, she bulldogged every member of the Joker's Wild gang, pumping them for information, taking copious notes. She knew her only hope lay with the surly gang of bikers who said they were Ava's friends. But no one would talk. They were all afraid of George Patsalos. The weeks unfolded into years, but Debbie endured, even though she was forced to realize her sister was probably dead.
My friends say that when I get resolve on an issue, that I don't let go. And I guess I'd wavered in my own heart and mind many times about what I always knew that she was dead, but I wavered in my own mind about what could have happened.
In 1996, a news story caught Debbie's eye. A story about a woman in a footlocker. Her remains were found in Frederick, Maryland in 1982, the same year Ava disappeared. Techniques weren't as sophisticated then.
The body had been misidentified, and the new identification was a young girl, 22 to 26, the right height, right weight. She was found within 4 weeks of my sister's disappearance and had been missing been in the trunk approximately for 4 to 6 weeks. And so I just really had a very emotional response to that.
The search for her sister would lead her to the largest collection of anatomical remains in the United States. In April 1996, renowned forensic authority Doug Owsley of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington applied his expertise to putting a face on the lady in the trunk.
Well, that was then printed in the papers, and it turned out that Debbie DeHart, the sister of Ava DeHart, happened to see that in the newspapers, and she thought, could that possibly be Ava? Because Ava had disappeared in 1982.
Encouraged by the preliminary description of the lady in the trunk, Debbie acquired Ava's dental records so Owsley could compare them. But sadly, the dental work didn't match. The lady in the trunk was not Ava DeHart. Debbie DeHart's quest showed no sign of ending. But the lady in the trunk provided some unexpected help after all.
There was so much publicity surrounding it. There were TV people and media people pursuing me, and I did some interviews. And as a result of that, I started to get phone calls. People were interested again. And I got some anonymous calls, people with little bits and pieces of information, but information I had needed all along.
After 14 years of pushing, Debbie finally felt like she was making progress. She knew this could be her last chance. She hired private investigator Al Baker to help her follow up with the former members of the Joker's Wild gang.
We began making contact with various people, which Debbie was able to provide us with the names. She had done that thorough job as to know who was part of this group, how we could contact most of them.
Nobody knew anything definite. Many were still afraid of George Patsalos. But one name kept coming up, Barbara Campfield, the woman who became Patsalos' girlfriend after Ava, and who eventually married him. One woman in particular said she helped Campfield clean up some blood at the Joker's Wild after Ava's disappearance. At the time, Campfield told her that the blood was the result of a fight. It seemed that Barbara Campfield knew something. But what? Debbie had already tried speaking with her, but got nowhere. Now Baker gave it a try.
I started off by introducing myself to her, providing my card, giving her phone numbers, and calmly explaining to her that we were now in the investigation with the DeHart family and that we were not going away, that this investigation would continue, was not going to stop, and we were going to talk to everybody we could to try and find out where Ava was.
Baker kept pursuing Campfield. Realizing that Baker wasn't going to let up, she was persuaded to work out a deal. She began cooperating with Detective Bowler and the Stafford County Sheriff's Department. She directed them to an abandoned home site outside of town. Campfield told Bowler that on the night Ava disappeared, George Patsalos asked Campfield to help him dump something heavy down a well. He told her not to ask any questions. She never dared to.
The well was pointed out to us. We subsequently got a search warrant for the property. Went there with the assistance of the state police and the Orange County Sheriff's Office, and called the Fairfax County Fire and Rescue folks to come help us actually in the excavation of the well.
After making sure the conditions were safe, the fire and rescue workers were slowly lowered into the claustrophobic depths of the well. The hole was less than 2 feet square and 19 feet deep. Soon, the workers were hauling up buckets of soil and debris, years of accumulated leaves and dirt that concealed whatever lay below. Then the bones started coming out. They were laid on the ground beside the well so an anthropologist could see what they'd found and what was missing. It was clear the bones were human and female.
We found pretty much probably the best part of her whole skeleton in various pieces and forms as we brought those out. Really, they came out in out of the well.
It seemed the mystery of Ava's disappearance had been solved. But were these truly her remains? A comparison of the jaw with Ava's dental records confirmed the terrible yet reassuring truth. Debbie Dehart's sister had been found.
Well, it's certainly better for us to have found her than to have never found her. I don't think we realized how deep the wound was or how it would never heal if we hadn't found her.
For the Deharts, and in the name of justice, Owsley was entrusted with determining how Ava had died.
My role is to state what the facts are. And to do that, what you have to do is pay very careful attention to the skeleton, to the bones. And if you know how to read the bones, they just are, it's phenomenal what they can tell you. This particular skeleton of Ava DeHart, it tells you exactly what happened to her. And it also provides all the clues that helps with the determination of her identification.
Owsley studied every inch, scrutinized every fracture to try to determine the cause of death. Was she murdered elsewhere, then dumped in the well? Was she killed by the 19-foot drop? Or was she still alive, trapped, and left to die? The injuries caused by the fall were restricted to the lower half of her body.
Fractures in the foot, the lower leg bones, the thigh bones, and the pelvis are the result of being dropped in the well. When she was dropped in the well, her feet hit the bottom, and that caused breakage of some of the bone. As the force goes up the shin bone, then it causes jamming at the knee joint. And in relation to this, then when you look at the distal end of the femur, these fit together like this, the force compresses into the distal end of the femur, and it causes this compression fracturing right here.
From the condition of her remains, Owsley determined that Ava was probably dead before she was thrown into the well.
This blow to the midface, where it actually broke 4 bones. It broke part of the right maxilla, the left maxilla, and both nasal bones. It just sheared the nasal bones off. And that's telling you that it's coming from her right to left, but it's also going up because there's a slight oblique angle here in the nasal bones. There's no sign of a tool or any being hit with a specific type of weapon. This is something that apparently was done with a fist.
There was not a part of the skeleton that didn't have some type of injury.
It was savage. That's the only way that you can classify it, because he was simply out to kill the girl.
George Patsalos, now living in Florida, was charged with the murder of Ava DeHart. At the trial, Owsley presented Ava's remains to the jury. Through his forensic interpretation, she was able to testify against her killer.
I think that Doug felt that the dramatic way she died, that she would speak to the jury, that it would be Ava telling the jury look what happened to me. And I believe the Commonwealth kind of used those exact words. Look what happened to me.
On October 8, 1997, George Patsalos was sentenced to life in prison for his crimes. The case against Patsalos was solved through forensics, detective work, and second-hand accounts. But suppose a crime had no witnesses, no crime scene, and no trace of a body. In April 1992, a 13-year-old Chevette was towed into an impoundment lot in Louisville, Kentucky. There, it joined the ranks of other abandoned vehicles, awaiting their date with the crusher. At the time, no one knew it, but this car held a terrible secret. Everyone in New Albany, Indiana, knew that Eric Humbert and Jonathan Whitesides were the best of friends. They worked together in the U.S. Geological Survey, and they played together after work and on the weekends. So it only seemed fitting that John Whitesides was the last person to see Eric Humbert alive. On the evening of January 15, 1991, after a game of hoops with their coworkers, the two drove to the auto shop to drop Whiteside's truck off for repairs before heading home. But by 9:30 that night, Humbert still hadn't arrived at his house. Eric's wife, Missy, said she phoned Whitesides to see if he'd seen him. Whitesides told her Eric had left just a few minutes ago and assured her he'd be arriving home any minute. But the minutes turned to hours. At 2 a.m., Missy called Whitesides again. Eric still wasn't home, and she was worried. Jonathan said he'd be right over. Eric never returned. Though Missy had spoken to the police the day after Eric disappeared, she didn't file an official missing persons report until 2 weeks later. Their relationship was becoming strained, and she thought Eric may just have wanted a little time by himself. But now she felt something terrible had happened. Eric was gone too long. He wouldn't have left his 18-month-old son. That wasn't like him. Detective Keith Whitlow of the New Albany Police led the investigation.
We began interviewing coworkers. There was rumors that Eric may have had a girlfriend in another state. We checked with that person, and she hadn't seen Eric. So his disappearance was pretty mysterious to everyone. Not only was he gone, but also was his automobile. They were without a trace.
But something of interest did come from interviewing Missy's coworkers. Many said that Jonathan frequently picked her up at work. Some claimed that Jonathan and Missy were having an affair. Suspicions centered around Jonathan Whitesides, but there was not the slightest evidence that anything illegal had happened. Nothing to link him to any wrongdoing. The two may have been guilty of indiscretion, but there's no law against that. Months went by. It seemed the earth had swallowed up Eric Humbert and his car. Meanwhile, Whitesides moved in with Missy and her son. Then, in April, 4 months after Eric was reported missing, a white Chevette turned up in a state impoundment lot in Louisville, Kentucky. Unclaimed, it was about to be sold or scrapped.
But they decided, as a matter of routine, to make one last check with the National Crime Information Center to see if this car was in fact stolen and whether they could locate the owner. When they did, they got a hit on the car showing that the car was part of a missing persons investigation right across the Ohio River from them in New Albany, Indiana. We were very, very close to losing a very key piece of the puzzle.
The car belonged to Eric Humbert. It was stripped of its tags. In the hatchback were traces of blood.
Look at that.
Louisville detectives interviewed Whitesides, the last person to see Humbert alive.
Do you know who killed Eric Humbert?
No.
He consented to a polygraph exam.
Do you know where Eric Humbert is?
No.
He failed.
Did you kill Eric Humbert?
No.
When confronted with the results, Whitesides admitted he knew more than he let on. He told police that after the basketball game on the night Eric disappeared, the two men drove to the auto shop to drop off Whiteside's truck. Afterward, they drove to Whiteside's house to work on another car. From there, Whiteside's story took a bizarre twist.
He says that suddenly Eric went into a rage and accused him of having an affair with his wife and produced a knife, and an altercation, a physical altercation between the two men developed there in the garage. During the scuffle, Jonathan claimed that Eric was accidentally stabbed in the throat, which, according to Jonathan, proved to be fatal.
Jonathan panicked. He thought nobody would believe the freak accident. He loaded the body into the back of the Chevette, drove several miles to a remote spot on the Ohio River, and dumped it in. He couldn't recall exactly where he unloaded it. The police were skeptical of Whiteside's tale. After his statement, he was arrested while they checked out his story.
It just didn't pan out. It just didn't seem logical. We even had officers simulate the combat that he had described, and we found it very difficult to believe that it happened the way that he said that it did.
Unless the body turned up, the only physical evidence to prove or refute Whiteside's story was the blood-stained Chevette. The stains in the hatchback were consistent with a wounded body being stashed there. But one feature stood out. The trunk liner contained an unusual pattern, 5 lines of blood shaped like a chevron. Some blood-soaked object had been pressed against the liner, causing the marks. They were parallel, so they couldn't be impressions of fingers. The stain was notable, but meaningless, at least so far. Under the hood, investigators found a large spatter of blood. In it was a bright green fiber. No one could explain how it got there or what it meant. Inside the engine compartment appeared what looked like human tissue. It was sent off for analysis. Forensics expert Rod Englert was brought in to study the blood evidence. He found the fine mist of blood on the distributor cap wasn't consistent with a knife wound. He demonstrates.
What I'm going to do is take some blood here, and let's say that the end of this eyedropper is the end of a knife. And let's say that it has gone into my neck, and I draw it back to maybe stab again or just pull it out very quickly. What it will cause is what's called cast off, and cast off is a resultant pattern that you see there. Now, if you put these two together, as we have here, there's an enormous amount of difference between those two patterns.
A knife wound creates a cast-off that comes from one direction. But what Englert saw on the distributor cap was multi-directional.
And that only comes about through gunshot.
To Englert, the cloudy mist of blood clearly showed that Whitesides was lying.
Origin of that blood.
In Indiana, the pattern of bloodstains in Eric Humbert's Chevette raised doubts that he was stabbed in the throat. More doubts were raised at the forensics lab in Oregon, where the tissue sample collected from the engine was studied by Ray Grimsboe. Microscopic analysis revealed the tissue was human, but it wasn't from anyone's neck.
The arrangement of the cells, how the cells stained from the cell, it was brain tissue. It was not from the skin or exfoliated tissue from some other area. This was neural tissue. We had to figure out then, how does it get out of a neck wound? And logically, it couldn't happen that way.
A closer examination of the car revealed a single bullet hole concealed at the base of the windshield wiper. 2 small fragments were recovered and sent to Grimsbo. He confirmed they were fragments of a bullet and its copper jacket. But most intriguing was the single tiny green fiber clinging to the bullet. He didn't know what to make of it. One thing was certain. The car was the scene of a shooting, not a stabbing. Whiteside's story wasn't washing. Seeking the truth, investigators went to the garage at the house where Jonathan Whitesides was living. The garage where he said his friend had accidentally stabbed himself to death. The crime scene was now 4 months old. Would anything be left? At first sight, the garage looked clean. But soon, a 9mm cartridge was found. Days later, a 9mm handgun was retrieved from Whiteside's work van. It seemed Eric Humbert had been shot. The brain tissue and the trajectory of the bullet indicated he was shot in the head. But something was missing. Something didn't seem right.
No, we don't have a lot of blood spatter. Normally when someone gets shot in the head, we have blood and gore everywhere. In this situation, we had very little. So when we were able to identify that tissue, then as coming from the brain, basically, the spatter, the bullet fragment, all tended to fit together. This person probably was shot through the head. Then the question became, how'd that happen without getting it everywhere? Well, the small green fiber. I think that's when the little light went on in my head that we have green fiber on this bullet. Bingo, that's why we don't have the blood. He had a cap on.
The weave pattern of the bloodied watch cap could also have made the chevron-shaped marks in the hatchback. The evidence so far was compelling and consistent, but was it enough to convince a jury the victim was truly Eric Humbert? All attempts to find a body met with failure.
Our body turned out to be a small piece of brain matter and some blood splatters.
The forensics team performed a DNA test on the blood. Problem was, they had nothing to compare it to. To go forward, they'd have to work backward. Blood relatives share similarities in their DNA. The forensics team counted on this to approximate Eric's genetic profile.
To identify Eric Humbert required just a paternity test, basically. We did a family history. We had his mother, his 2 living siblings, and his son and his wife. And so we typed them with DNA, and we took the unknown blood and the tissue from the scene, typed it.
To assure that the evidence wasn't contaminated, the DNA was tested simultaneously at 2 separate labs. The results were consistent, but investigators were still not satisfied. The forensics team needed to get DNA from both of Humbert's parents to be sure their findings were precise and irrefutable. Permission was obtained to exhume his father, who died several years earlier. DNA was extracted from his father's leg bones. The genetic codes from Humbert's father and mother were compared to the DNA from the blood in the Chevette.
We were able to show that, beyond any reasonable doubt, that this would have been consistent with a son of those 2 people.
Even without Eric Humbert's body, the prosecution had all it needed to convict Jonathan Whitesides. The prosecution alleged that on the last evening of Eric Humbert's life, he went to Jonathan Whitesides' house to help him fix his car. He may have suspected that his best friend was having an affair with his wife, but he couldn't have known how much his best friend wanted him out of the way. While Humbert leaned over his own car to show Whitesides how he made a similar repair in his Chevette, Whitesides pulled out a 9mm pistol and shot his friend execution style at point-blank range.
Wow.
He then loaded the body into the back of the car, disposed of it, and
Wow.
abandoned the
You got to
vehicle.
be pretty mad at
He
somebody.
thought that by eliminating the body, he'd eliminated all the evidence. He was wrong.
Whenever a criminal enters or leaves a crime scene, he always leaves something there. He always takes something with him.
Oh, that's it.
And I think that's very, very true. It's just today we are much more capable of finding those things that they take and leave than maybe we were just 10 years ago.
The jury deliberated only 45 minutes before finding Jonathan Whitesides guilty of murder. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison.
Ooh. Ooh.
As for Eric Hubbard, so far his body hasn't been found.
Okay.
Eric's mother
Why be pissed at
told me
him?
after
Shit.
Jonathan was
Why the
sentenced,
50
she
years
grabbed
in
him by the
prison?
arm and she said, please don't quit looking for him. And it's kind of ironic. Every time we get information about a body found locally or something, it's like nobody has to say it. Everybody goes, I wonder if that's Eric. And not as yet it hadn't been, but we're still in some way we're still looking.
Not too long ago, the victims were laws of justice have allied with the laws of science. And even if the victim can't be found, chances are the killer will be. Police find a family murdered in their home. The victims are covered with strange marks. To catch the killer, forensics experts must find out what caused the wounds. A request for roadside assistance is a pretext for murder. Can telltale marks on a car battery connect the killer to the crime? Police are on the trail of a psychopath. Investigators must rely on an ordinary screwdriver to stop him in his tracks. Like fingerprints, tool marks found at a crime scene can single out a murderer. More than one killer has tripped himself up on his own tools of death. In January 1992, police responded to a call made by the neighbors of Juan and Olga Hernandez. They reported a violent commotion coming from their home. Upon entering, Chicago officers found the body of Juan Hernandez lying face down in the living room. He was apparently beaten and killed.
Stop. Lay down. Eddie, lay down.
As they cautiously searched the house, police entered the nursery. And discovered Olga Hernandez was also dead. Nearby lay the body of her 10-month-old daughter.
No.
The Hernandez home showed no signs of forced entry. The killer or killers left no clues to their identity.
Wow. And they killed a baby. You know that's wrong.
The detectives on Chicago's homicide squad had seen a lot of horrible crimes. But nothing in their experience could have prepared them for what they witnessed that night. From the brutality of the murders, it looked as though the killer had come there with the sole purpose of killing this family. Detective Richard Zuley was one of the detectives on the scene.
It was actually the worst beating I've ever seen. And initially, we couldn't tell whether or not it was just a beating or if there was a weapon like a shotgun maybe involved, because there was just so much blood on the scene.
The medical examiner determined that the victims had been beaten to death with a weapon that left hundreds of U and J-shaped bruises. Neither the medical examiner nor the officers at the scene could identify what could have caused the peculiar marks. Zuley's partner, Detective John Murray, knew they had no chance of finding the weapon until they knew what it was.
Time is of the essence, because if we can identify what it was, and we were thinking of a meat tenderizer, a tire jack, all kinds of things, now it would be important to get back to the scene or the area of the murder to try to recover it.
Detectives knew that identifying what caused the marks was the first step to finding the killer. Whoever he was, he had thoroughly covered his tracks, leaving behind only the telltale wounds.
Okay, Eddie, move over, please. Okay?
Any tool leaves its mark on the object it manipulates. In police work, that principle is usually applied to firearms.
Ice cream.
To see if a particular gun had been used in a crime,
Ice
a
cream,
ballistics
ice
expert
cream.
test fires it.
Snack time.
The signature markings on the test-fired bullet are then compared with markings on the bullet retrieved from the crime scene. If the markings are the same, the case is made. When a tool is used in a beating death, the task is a similar one. By examining characteristics of a victim's wounds, experts can often prove that one tool and one tool only was the instrument of death. Hoping to identify the wounds on the bodies of Juan and Olga Hernandez, the medical examiner sent photos of the markings to the Chicago Police Crime Lab. Forensic investigator Bill Sherlock, an expert in firearms and tool mark identification, compared the marks against various tools.
Baby that was murdered in this case.
The wounds were consistent in size and shape, bruises left by a heavy object. But in the curved area at the bottom of each wound, the skin had been broken.
We weren't sure what type of tool it was. I was not aware of any tool that would make this kind of marks, any store-bought tool, any of the tools that are used by the various trades. So it was kind of a challenge to try and find out what made these particular markings.
After nearly a week of testing one kind of tool after another, Sherlock could not find an absolute match. The most likely weapon was the butt of an automatic pistol, but Sherlock wasn't completely satisfied with that conclusion. If used like a hammer, the butt of a pistol could have caused the bruises on the victim's skin, but not the lacerations.
The marks looked somewhat consistent with the marks from a butt of a gun. We couldn't explain why we had the tearing of the skin, why we had the shapes that we had.
A chance event provided Detective Zuley with a possible explanation. Off duty, he realized he held a likely answer in the palm of his hand.
At home one day, I was cleaning my gun. And as I slid the magazine out of the gun, I was cleaning it, looking at it, and I thought, gee, that's kind of similar in shape to the wounds.
With its magazine removed, the butt of a semi-automatic pistol would have thinner, sharper edges, more capable of leaving the marks seen on the murder victims. Without the magazine and its bullets, the gun would be lighter and less effective as a bludgeon. It would have taken longer to inflict fatal wounds. Sherlock tested his theory on a slab of modeling clay.
That looks like it.
The butt of a medium caliber pistol produced marks of the same size and shape as the wounds on the victims.
I mean,
So now we kind of knew that we were
that
looking
person?
for that a gun was used to do this, but we still didn't know what gun or
I mean,
where.
damn.
Anything else that came later.
Forensics had identified the type of weapon used to commit the crimes, but could it be linked to a killer?
Talk about a headache. I mean, please don't beat me. Just go ahead and just shoot
Officers on
me.
the narcotics squad got a tip from a prostitute who'd heard something on the street. She told police that a woman named Patricia Johnson seemed to know about the killings. Her boyfriend was a known drug dealer, a Cuban named Ronaldo Travieso. Police brought him in for questioning. He refused to talk. Meanwhile, detectives checked the victims' phone records. On the night they were murdered, Juan and Olga Hernandez had ordered a pizza. Questioned by the police, the delivery man said that on the night of the killings, he recalled going to the address of Juan and Olga Hernandez. But when a woman answered the door, she told him she hadn't ordered a pizza. Police brought him to a lineup that included the suspect's girlfriend, Patricia Johnson. He recognized her as the woman who'd answered the door at the Hernandez home. When Johnson was told she'd been picked out of the lineup, she admitted being at the house that night. She told police Travieso was the killer. Her willingness to talk was a stark contrast to her boyfriend.
He was stoic and friendly and very polite, but a guy that could sit upright in a chair for hours and talk to you freely.
Murray questioned Travieso again. Years of interviewing suspects had taught the detective to read subtle gestures that could reveal more than words alone. But Travieso wasn't playing.
If you were conscious like we are very often on the body language, very, very, very important. This guy showed nothing. A real sociopath.
But police were sure he knew something. A witness had ID'd his girlfriend, who had turned on him, and he was named by an informant. As detectives turned up the pressure, Travieso decided to come clean. The story had begun 2 years earlier, when he and Juan Hernandez came over from Cuba together. They planned to get rich dealing drugs. But that wasn't how it worked out, at least for Hernandez.
Both were in the drug business. And as time went on, the murderer became quite a bit more successful in the drug trade than the victim.
In their first year of business, Travieso had supplied Hernandez with a kilo of cocaine to sell. The street value was approximately $20,000. But the drugs disappeared, and the money never materialized. Travieso demanded payment, but Hernandez held him off. A month later, Travieso decided to give Hernandez a second chance and gave him another kilo to sell. But that too disappeared. Travieso had trusted Hernandez, and his trust had been betrayed. Now it was time to collect. Patricia Johnson's statement confirmed that Travieso had used the butt of his gun to kill Juan and Olga. The confessions had come as a surprise, but the law demands more than a confession to ensure a conviction. At trial, the defense could argue that a confession was coerced, or the
beating would
defendant
be
could recant it.
far worse for
To
me
make their
than
case,
to be
police needed
shot.
to provide corroborating
I
evidence.
mean, like I said, just shoot me.
They needed to
Don't
find
beat
the
me.
weapon.
That just prolonged the pain.
Johnson had told police she'd wrapped the gun in a plastic sack. From a moving car, she tossed it off a bridge into the river. To aid divers in their search for the weapon, Zuli and Murray crisscrossed the bridge, tossing out stones of similar size and weight as a medium caliber pistol.
I won't beat me into the water.
John and I spent a day driving across
I
the
know I
bridge
couldn't do it.
with rocks about the same size and weight of a medium caliber weapon. We drove across, throwing them out of the squad car and into the river. And noting that they were all landing about the same distance from the bridge in about the same place.
To coordinate their search, divers stretched polyester rope across the river, forming a grid. It took them less than half an hour to find the sack containing the gun, near the spot where Zuli and Murray had tossed their stones. The weapon was a .32 caliber semi-automatic pistol. With its magazine removed, police believed it could have caused the unusual wounds on the victims' bodies. But to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, the detectives needed harder evidence. Evidence only a forensics expert could provide. Police divers in Chicago had found what they believed to be a murder weapon in a plastic bag. Cuban immigrant Juan Hernandez had taken drugs to sell on consignment, then never delivered the cash. Now, he, his wife, and his infant child were dead. Bill Sherlock of the Chicago Police Crime Lab attempted to establish the gun as the murder weapon. Not as a firearm, but as a tool used to bludgeon the victims to death. Sherlock had already determined that the unusual wounds on the victims' bodies were most likely caused by the butt of a semi-automatic pistol with its magazine removed.
As we're looking at the marks on the victims' heads, it's consistent with the tearing being with the front portion of the magazine well, the thinner metal, the side wall, and also the magazine release back here, the serration from the magazine release.
At first glance, Sherlock believed the pistol found by divers could have caused the wounds. To make a positive identification, he obtained a copy of the autopsy photographs, being sure they were exactly to scale. He then obtained a 1-to-1 transparency of the butt of the gun with its magazine removed. He placed the transparency over the life-size photograph of the wound. After closely comparing the gun's metal edges with the cuts on the victims, Sherlock felt he had a perfect match. His testimony could now remove any doubts about the statements of the two defendants. He'd forged an irrefutable link between them and the tool of death.
What it was invaluable for was in bringing this case into court and having a solid piece of expert testimony to present in court to the jurors and say, this is this because this is the results of my tests. That's a lot more powerful than Detective Zuli or Detective Murray standing there going, geez, it looks the same, I think it's the same. They were able to show conclusively that it was the same.
Reynaldo Travieso's pistol became a bludgeon by accident. He'd come to the home of Juan Hernandez, hoping one last time to get the money he was owed. But Hernandez didn't have enough. Travieso put the pistol to his head and pulled the trigger, but the magazine jammed. Enraged, he resorted to beating his victim. In the process, the gun magazine fell out. When the pizza men arrived, Travieso had already begun beating Juan Hernandez with the butt of his gun. But the unpaid debt hadn't been satisfied. After Juan was killed, Olga Hernandez would also die, along with the baby she did everything to protect.
And clearly, in examining the scene, it was apparent to us that Mrs. Hernandez was doing what she could to try to protect her child during the course of this attack. That involved a whole emotional thing that you have to deal with too on the scene. When you recreate the scene and you're visualizing what happens, you're creating all of it. So you can imagine the terror and the fear and everything else that was happening.
Hopefully we'll never see them on the street again.
No.
Tool mark evidence had made a critical difference in putting Reynaldo Travieso and Patricia Johnson behind bars. Both were sent to prison for life. In Louisiana in 1984, police had to rely on more subtle tool mark evidence to crack a case of murder. Responding to the report of a shooting in the small town of Zachary, 15 miles from Baton Rouge, police found a car with its hood raised, parked at the side of the road. Nearby lay the body of George Thompson, shot at close range with a shotgun. No one witnessed the shooting, and the killer left no obvious clues. But battery cables dangling from the front of the victim's car gave police an idea of what had happened. One end of the cables was still attached to the victim's battery. Had he been the one who needed a boost, or had he stopped to help someone else? The victim's car started without any problem.
Well, looks like AAA might come into play. Okay.
He pulled off the road to assist another driver. If
No.
police could find the second
That
car,
means don't
they
stop.
could also locate the killer. A Baton Rouge detective visited the wife of the victim.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Detective Tom Harris. I just have a couple of questions to ask you.
She had gone to church on the night of the murder. When she returned home around 10 p.m., her husband told her he had to help someone start his car. He left without saying exactly where he was going. According to Lois Thompson, her husband rarely went out that late. Whoever it was he was going to help must have been a close friend. Lois Thompson never saw her husband again. It seemed to police that the call for assistance was a trap. They suspected the killer may have lured the victim to the crime scene with a plea for help.
But you had to have known him. Well, you don't go out for a stranger, especially if they call you at home.
The battery cables might bear the killer's fingerprints. They were sent for examination to forensic expert Pat Lane of the Louisiana Crime Lab. He placed the cables in a fuming chamber designed to make latent fingerprints visible. results were negative.
We didn't come up with any fingerprints on any of the clamps or the cable. So essentially, the fingerprint examination was a washout, and I thought that I was going to be through with this evidence at that time.
The case stalled until a few days later, when detectives got a phone call that brought them a lead. The caller told police to check out a parking lot at an apartment complex in Baton Rouge. Police found a yellow Buick that matched the description of the second car observed by a passerby prior to the murder. It belonged to Brenda Perkins. The tip was placed by her neighbor, a relative of the victim. Faced with suspicion of involvement in a murder, Perkins was more than willing to talk to police. Detective Bernie Taylor of the Zachary Police was at the scene.
One of the questions that, naturally came up is, had he been having trouble with his car? Perhaps, battery trouble.
The car had a brand new battery. Perkins told police she'd had no trouble starting it.
So at this point here, we kind of fits in with our thought that, hey, this was a set-up deal with no car trouble to begin with. He just was lured out there under that pretense.
Perkins explained that her uncle, Earl Thomas, had borrowed the car on the night of the murder. Thomas was the brother-in-law of the murder victim. But Brenda Perkins had even more damaging evidence. The day of the murder, she'd gone shopping with Earl Thomas. He'd made only one purchase, shotgun shells. Perkins asked him why he needed them. At first, he said for hunting. But with deer season several weeks away, she prodded him to tell her the truth. He said he planned to murder his brother-in-law, the victim, George Thompson. A receipt found in the trunk of Perkins' car totaled $2.97 plus tax. Brenda had noticed both the size and brand name of the shells her uncle had purchased. To check out her story, the detectives went to the same store and purchased a similar box of shells. The amount on the receipt was $2.97 plus tax. Exactly the same as the receipt found in the car. Lane also found Thomas's thumbprint on the shopping bag. The detectives now had circumstantial evidence that Earl Thomas was the killer, but they required something more solid. They looked for what they needed under the hood of the victim's car. Through forensics, they hoped to turn a scratched piece of soft lead into hard evidence. In the murder of George Thompson, Louisiana police were building their case against his brother-in-law, Earl Thomas. Had Thomas set a trap for Thompson, calling for help and then killing him? The case was missing one crucial element, a way to link Thomas to the crime scene. Booster cables were still attached to the victim's car battery. If the victim had time to attach the cables to the killer's car, the clamps may have left marks on the battery. The battery of the car driven by the suspect, Earl Thomas, had fresh tool marks, apparently made by a booster cable. Police asked forensic examiner Pat Lane to see if the marks were made by the cables found at the crime scene. It was the only way to place the suspect's car at the scene. Just like people, every tool leaves behind a unique fingerprint that can be used to identify it. The suspect's battery not only had bite marks left by the teeth of a booster cable, it also had a scratch, apparently caused when the cable was hastily removed. Lane suspected that a single tooth on one of the jaws of the cable may have caused the scratch. To test his theory, he took the cable found at the crime scene and made test marks on a flat piece of lead. A comparison microscope enables him to examine two sets of marks at the same time. On one side were the marks on the suspect's battery clamp. On the other, the marks made by the victim's battery cables.
The ultimate determination in any tool mark examination is, was this tool or this instrument responsible for making a particular mark? And in this particular examination, my determination was the mark that we see on this clamp here in the monitor and this reference mark that I know to have been made by the jumper cables have the same source.
Tool mark evidence had placed the car driven by Earl Thomas at the scene of the crime. A warrant was issued for his arrest, but Thomas had gone to California. His address was unknown. Detectives traced all the calls he made to his sister in Baton Rouge to a public phone booth in East Los Angeles. Within days, he was picked up at the booth by Los Angeles police. They didn't have a hard time spotting him. He was a tall man, missing his left arm.
Yeah.
Detective Bernie Taylor and his partner Charlie Clark had already pieced together how the killing occurred. The victim was married to Thomas's sister, but was being unfaithful. To uphold the family honor, Thomas decided to put a stop to his brother-in-law's philandering once and for all. He borrowed Perkins' car, then called the victim, pretending to need help. As the victim clamped a booster cable to the battery of Thomas's car, Thomas retrieved his shotgun. It was a nice theory, but Thomas denied any involvement in the crime. Detective Clark was concerned a jury might think a one-armed man incapable of firing a shotgun.
You ever do any hunting?
Oh yeah, I love hunting.
Yeah.
Oh, we
What kind of hunting you do?
deer, squirrels, just generally hunting. You know, it's just fun.
What kind of gun do you hunt with?
What's shotgun?
But Thomas's gift for gab tripped him up.
Well, what do you think? I think he's a con artist.
Mm-hmm.
Earl was a con artist. He rambled. If you ask him about the case, then he would start rambling on something else. And so we knew that he did hunt. And so we started asking about his hunting. And so I asked him, well, Earl, how do you handle that shotgun when you only got one hand, you know? And Earl said, well, I just put this arm out like this and lay that shotgun in on here and steady it. And he said, no problem.
I told you, leave her alone. Man. Don't do that to her, man.
Earl Thomas successfully entrapped his brother-in-law with his scheme, but the hunter also unwittingly snared himself. The scratches from the clamp marked Thomas as the killer.
This lead clamp, $1.98 piece of lead, put a man in jail for 20 plus years. When Bernie Taylor brought this piece of evidence into the laboratory, I knew exactly what he wanted before he ever finished the request. And I told Bernie at that time, I said, Bernie, it's theoretically possible, but I have to tell you it's a long shot. But we'll give it our best shot. And ultimately, this piece of evidence was linked to not just one pair of jumper cables, not just one clamp, but to one tooth on one clamp of that pair of jumper cables.
Get back in, get set.
In the small town of Zachary, solid detective work turned a case of circumstantial evidence into a conviction based on forensic science.
And so the challenge to us is to find and to establish the link from the crime scene to that individual. And when that takes place, there's usually not cameras and lights, there's not a lot of glamour. There's a tremendous amount of satisfaction in going home at night and knowing that the work that I've done has made this town a little bit safer place to live in.
Thompson's death was the result of a personal vendetta. But in Florida in 1990, murder became a terrifyingly random event, and police were paralyzed by lack of clues. On August 26th, students were returning for the fall semester at the University of Florida in Gainesville. On that Sunday afternoon, Ricky and George Powell went to the campus to see their daughter Christina's new apartment. But when they arrived, neither their daughter nor her roommate answered the door or telephone. The parents asked the building manager to let them in, but the women had changed the lock. The manager didn't have a key. The Powells' concern grew with every hour their daughter was away. Fearing the worst, they contacted the police. A Gainesville police officer met them at the apartment. He then forced open the door. As he entered, he saw a dead woman posed on the couch. He blocked the parents from following him. He didn't want them to disturb the evidence, and he feared the killer might still be inside. But the officer found not the killer, but a second murder victim. Both women had been raped, then stabbed. The brutality of the crime and the way the bodies had been staged made police fear that they were dealing with more than a random killer. Whoever murdered these women was cunning and methodical. Police feared it would only be a matter of time before he struck again. To help investigate the brutal double slaying, police throughout the county assisted the Gainesville police. Among them was Detective Sergeant LeGrand Hewitt of the Alachua County Sheriff's Office. And then the killer struck closer to home.
About midnight, Sunday night, one of our records clerks at the Alachua County Sheriff's Office failed to show up for work. Her supervisor and co-workers got concerned about that and notified our watch commander.
A deputy was sent to Krista Hoyt's apartment. No one came to the front door, but he saw a gap in her Venetian blinds.
The deputy got on his knees and put his flashlight up into the room that was there, and it happened to be Krista Hoyt's bedroom, and she was sitting on the side of the bed in a staged position, decapitated.
Adding to the horror, 2 days later, 2 more victims were found, raped and stabbed in a similar fashion. News of the killings electrified the University of Florida campus.
It's currently 27 minutes past the top of the hour. Just a reminder for University of Florida students back for the new semester, make sure you stay safe, keep doors and windows locked. Call SNAP, the Student Nighttime Auxiliary Patrol, if you need an escort around campus. Police are increasing patrols in the southwest Gainesville area around student apartment complexes.
Special Agent Ed Dix of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement recalls the mood in Gainesville at the time of the killings.
The city of Gainesville sort of started feeling a sense of terror, and the university has some 40,000 students, of which probably 20,000 or more are females. Parents started coming to get their children. It wasn't enough that they called for a well-being check. They actually just started showing up. The kids were calling home saying, "I'm ready to go," to the point that the university was closed for a week.
The police feared a ritual killer was on the loose. A serial madman who'd claimed 5 victims in 3 days. In each case, he forced his way past the locks on the doors. At the first location, he jimmied the lock of a wooden door. At the second and third locations, he'd removed the security pin from a sliding glass door. Special Agent Ed Dix believed the same tool had been used at the last 2 locations.
The sliding glass door had been broken and pried and had left some marks in the aluminum.
The police photographed the damaged areas around each of the sliding doors where the killer had gained entry. A section of the wooden door frame from the first location also was removed and sent to toolmark examiner David Warnement at the crime lab in Jacksonville. Experience told Warnement immediately what class of tool had been used to enter the victims' homes.
And the question was what type of tool was used to make the damage in the door sections from the first crime scene. I looked at them and could tell the investigators initially that they were looking for a 5/16" screwdriver with a type of blade that has a serrated tip or a corrugated type of tip on it.
Police removed the doors from the second and third crime scenes and sent them to the lab. They suspected the crimes were linked, but had no evidence to prove it. If they could match the tool marks found at the 3 crime scenes, they could prove the same person was responsible.
A week later, 2 doors came into the laboratory. The door from the second crime scene and the door from the third crime scene. I looked at the doors and found that there was damage around the lock on the door from the second crime scene and also on the door jamb, which came in with it. On the door from the third crime scene, there was also damage around the lock. And also I found that there was damage up around the security pin. There was a series of scratches in the security pin, around the security pin hole. And what I noticed was they were very typical, and they appeared to have been caused by trying to jimmy the door and remove the security pin and gain entry.
Warnement made a silicone cast of the damage on each of the doors. The silicone is mixed with a hardening agent. When it sets, it forms a perfect impression. After studying the impressions from the 3 crime scenes, Warnement concluded that the killer used a screwdriver with a 5/16" serrated blade. Police now knew that they were dealing with one killer who used the same screwdriver to break into his victims' homes. If they could find the screwdriver, they would find the killer. Over the next 4 months, throughout Florida, if a suspect was arrested with a screwdriver on his person or in his car, the tool was sent to David Warnement. Examined under a microscope, even the blade of a brand new screwdriver leaves a striated mark that's totally unique. It becomes more distinctive over time, acquiring the nicks and scratches that come from use. But after examining dozens of screwdrivers, Warniment found nothing that matched the tool marks at the crime scene. Police had few leads and no immediate suspects. A killer was on the loose, and they feared that more women would die. In November of 1990, 4 months after the first murder in Gainesville, police got a break from a routine computer check. A man picked up in Ocala for robbery was wanted in Shreveport, Louisiana for shooting his father. The computer had already identified Shreveport as the scene of a crime very similar to the murders in Gainesville. It might be a coincidence. But Special Agent Ed Dix decided to look for a connection between the suspect in Ocala and the Gainesville murders. Meanwhile, Sergeant Detective LeGrand Hewitt was following a different lead. Months earlier, shortly after the murders, a bank in Gainesville had been robbed. It was not far from the second murder scene. Shortly after the robbery, police officers saw 2 men enter the woods nearby. The suspects eluded police, who called for backup. A tracking dog was dispatched to pick up the scent. It led police to a small makeshift campsite. There, they found a large number of dye-marked bills, apparently stolen in the bank robbery that day. In a duffel bag, police found a semi-automatic weapon like the one used by the robber, some duct tape, and a cassette player. On the tape was what seemed to be a veiled message. The man on the tape identified himself as Danny Rowland. He sang a total of 11 songs he'd written himself, mostly to the tune of The House of the Rising Sun. The tape ended with what was possibly the chilling prelude to murder. This is not the road I wanted, but I will walk it like a man. I got something I gotta do. The tape proved that Rowling had been in Gainesville at the same time the killings occurred. At the campsite, police had also found a screwdriver. But at the time, there had been no reason to suspect Rowling's involvement in murder. His apparent MO was bank robbery, a crime far removed from brutal sex crimes. At first, the screwdriver wasn't examined.
The investigators had said it was essentially a screwdriver from a campsite that was occupied by a bank robber. And at that time, no one attached any significance to the campsite. But there was evidently something in the back of my mind that just said, told me not to eliminate the tool.
Warniment decided to take a closer look at the screwdriver.
Test on from the screwdriver from the campsite on the microscope, and also my silicone cast of the marks from the door from the third crime scene. And within about 5 or 10 minutes, I all of a sudden saw a tremendous correspondence of individual characteristics, and thought to myself, I've just identified this screwdriver as making the damage on the door from the third crime scene.
He performed a similar test on the sliding door from the second crime scene.
And again, compared them directly to the screwdriver blade in this case, and I was able to see enough correspondence to say that the screwdriver from the campsite caused the damage on the door and the door jamb from the second crime scene.
The tool marks proved that the screwdriver found at Danny Rowling's campsite was the same tool used to break into the victim's apartments. Faced with the mounting evidence against him, Rolling decided to reveal the criminal life he'd led.